Thanks for tuning in to the Diaphragm Dynasty. I'm back with more of a debate topic, and today I will be debating about two 90s groups that were very dominant in the 90s, very entertaining in the 90s, had different personalities, but definitely had a lot of talent. So I'm debating two groups of being better in between Dru Hill and Jodeci. So these groups are more of the traditional R&B types. Unlike, a group like Pretty Ricky that had elements of hip hop in it, or a group like TLC who definitely, had elements of traditional R&B, but groups that were, you know, four artists, one mic, type deals. Even though they probably didn't have that, but they were more in that setup, where they were choreographing things together, choreographing, um, just everything together. It was four people, one mic, four people, one objective. Those traditional types, and Dru Hill was more traditional than Jodeci was, even though they came after. Jodeci did pause, but they were. Um, you know, they both had a lot of talent and had a lot of hits and had a lot of impact. But the discussion about being who is better, which I hate who is better because it's such a generality, but who is better in terms of impact. Now, commercially, Dru Hill sold, around 3.5 million records, while Jodeci sold over 6 million records. And they both released 4 studio albums to date. So but when you think about individualities, the only person to really go solo in Dru Hill was Cisco, which he did pretty good, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But in Jodeci, Casey and JoJo, they went solo as a duo. But Cisco did sell over 6 million records by itself as a solo artist, and then Casey and JoJo sold about over 5 million. So Cisco himself was pretty much dominant, the most dominant person in all of the groups, because he had the thong song and incomplete. And his first album was pretty much untouchable. He had showed his writing prowess and his star power, similar to what Beyonce leaving Destiny's Child, or Omarion leaving B2K, or most of those groups have those stars that stand alone and eventually they go out on their own. Bobby Brown and New Edition, all of these artists, most of these groups you can point to, and one person leaves the group and they show who really made the group. And Cisco definitely proved that. But this argument is not about commercial success; it's more about impact. So, and the numbers don't always tell the whole story, as we know. There was once a famous quote that says, "Show me stats, and I'll show you lies." Just because you can juke the stats the way you want them to, and then you can make the numbers in your favor any way you want to. But impact, you can't fake impact. Or how Kendrick says, you can't fake impact. So, um, Dru Hill was a talented group, but it was centered around mostly Cisco, a phenomenal talent, and most people can't tell you more than two people in the group for Dru Hill unless they're true fans. But the casual fan can only tell you Cisco. But Jodeci was about a group. You knew everyone in the group, whether it be KC, JoJo, Devontae Swing. A lot of these people had individual careers that stood alone. Even Casey and JoJo, even Devontae Swing, doing songs with Tupac and doing songs with others. He was able to stand alone. But Dru Hill was just about Cisco. So we're talking about, in comparison to sports terms, the Boston's big three when they had Pierce, Garnett, and Allen against you know LeBron when he was with the Cavs before the first time, before he went to Miami. So you know thinking of in terms of that. But I personally like the Dru Hill discography better than Jodeci's. But when we talk about impact, I think Jodeci had way more impact just because of their appeal to women, and they had the sex appeal thing going on. And then they had the famous boots that everybody talked about, the Jodeci boots that they used to wear with the shoelaces untied and the swag that they had. And, just the leather jackets that they used to wear, the leather vests or whatever they had. And then they also had the signature ad libs that everyone talks about, the ooh yeahs and all of that that everybody mimicked, and they just created this culture of R&B that was similar to hip hop, but they had their own twang to it. Especially they were in the early '90s as well, but and into the late '90s, and they released a project I think early as 2015. But they had impact and culture that Dru Hill didn't have. Dru Hill didn't have they just had the hits and talent, but they didn't have any kind of marketing behind them, or they didn't have like a persona that most artists have. Now, when you talk about persona, you talk about a character they create. Cisco had that in his solo project with the platinum hair and with um, just the songs that he created, but nobody had the impact of like Jodeci as a group, especially in the R&B sense, because they had everything. And when I talked about the boots, and they talked about the ad libs, and just the sex appeal that they had on their songs, and they were more explicit than Dru Hill as well, because both artists or both groups talked about love making and things like that. But Jodeci was more explicit, like songs like "Fiending" and "Freaking You," these songs that we know define the '90s era and the sound of R&B, because it went from the '80s, "Baby I Need You" to the sex appeal stuff in the '90s to sell more records and things like that, because the sound of music changed from back when Marvin Gaye, was singing, and Diana Ross and all these other artists were singing. It became more explicit. And Dru Hill transitioned into that period of being more explicit. But then by the time Dru Hill got it, it kind of went back to the mellow side of things, even though they had elements of that as well. But nevertheless, I believe Jodeci had more impact, and Jodeci had more appeal, and Dru Hill doesn't get enough credit for the run of hits that they had. Looking back at the singles that they released, they had a 7 consecutive run of hits, from all the way from "Tell Me," "In My Bed," "Never Make a Promise," "Five Steps," "We're Not Making Love No More," "How Deep Is Your Love," and "These Are the Times." They released all those back to back. So if you're talking about who had the better hits, I would say Dru Hill. Of course, it's not even close. But if you're talking about impact on culture, Jodeci definitely had way more impact on the culture than Dru Hill had. So tell me, what are your thoughts about this? And as always, until next time, I'll see you next time.